Hi guys. So the next few videos will be covering globalization and international trade, sections 3 and 4. And as I begin section 3, I'd like to first start by consolidating sections 1 and sections 2 before we progress on to sections 3, because I think the difference between protectionism in section 2 and what we're doing in section 3 is a bit subtle. So I think it'd be very useful to have a rough idea of what the differences are. Okay, so first of all, in the very broad context of macro, and this is not new to you guys, you know that the overarching goal of macro is to increase the standard of living for the residents in the country, and the government can do so with 4 macro aims, and I've written down the 4 macro aims here. The first 3 are the domestic aims of the economy, and the last one, the favorable balance of payments, is the external aim of the economy. And this is where we have branched out. We are saying that when we are looking at balance of trade, we really are looking at the X minus M, the export revenue minus the import expenditure. But this really gives rise to a few questions. And the first question is, what is being traded? Right? And being traded is exported. And what is being imported? And by whom? So we do see that there is a great deal of traded goods and services around the world, and increasingly there is even greater volume of trade. But what is being traded and who are trading what goods? Who are exporting what goods and who are importing what goods? And then we want to ask, why is there trade? What are some of the benefits or gains from trade? And then we also want to answer, what are some of the limitations or costs of trade? Are there any losers in trade? Right? And these are really very important questions because they are the impacts of trade. So not just do we see what is happening, we also understand the impact of what is happening. And then if we see the impacts, we ask ourselves, is there any way to regulate? And that's where we study some policies on, protectionism. And there are some other trade policies which we will cover very soon. So these are the very natural questions when we study trade and globalization. And I just want to list out these questions in a very intuitive manner. Actually, you have already answered this. What is being traded and by whom? It is determined by the pattern of trade. And this in turn is determined by the comparative advantage. And Ms. Chen has taught you this in section 1. So the theory of comparative advantage governs what is being traded and by whom. Of course, that's the assumption we are operating with free trade. Okay? And then Ms. Chen has also covered what are some of the benefits of trade. And these gains from trade are the motivation to why we see trade in the first place. But not everything is rosy, because there will be arguments against trade, and these are due to the costs of trade, or some of the arguments brought forth by the losers of trade. Okay? And then, very naturally, if there are costs of trade, there will also be the next part, which is how then do we regulate trade in the sense of policies. And Ms. Chen have went through with you protectionism. So this protectionism is covered in section 2, and everything here is covered in section 1. And by now, you should have a very intuitive understanding of why we observe trade, and what are some of the pros and cons of trade, and some very good policies that can overcome some of the limitations that we see from trade. Okay, so where does that leave us? Today, we are going to cover section 3, which is trade policies. And some of you might be thinking, isn't protectionism a type of trade policy? And the answer is yes, protectionism is a type of trade policy. So trade policies actually is quite broad, but the focus of the entire section 3 is we want to map this guy to favorable balance of trade. So the entire section 3 is trying to answer, trying to suggest policies to make a balance of trade of a country more favorable, how to improve the balance of trade. Okay, so that's the position. You will realize as I cover the whole of section 3 that there are some overlaps here and there, and they are overlapped in section 2. In fact, there are some overlaps also in your previous set of lecture notes when you learn policies. But don't be too concerned with the overlaps. Just be sure of the objective. What's the aim, the main goal that we're trying to achieve with section 3. Right? Because this part is very much so still in the syllabus. So we want to very explicitly teach you how to write policies concerned with balance of trade. Okay, that leaves us with the overview of where we are in section 3. But before I start section 3 proper, I also want to give you another overview, and that is the framework for policies. In my opinion, section 3 can get a little bit messy because of the prior knowledge that you already have. Some of these policies have already been covered, and then you'll be asking, isn't this policy to achieve another objective instead? And so that's why I want to share with you the framework for policies. I believe if you understand this general framework, section 3 will really make a lot more sense to you. Okay, so for all kind of policies you see in econs, this is true and a general framework, be it for micro policies, macro policies, macro for domestic aims or for external aims. Any policy is will follow this framework, right? So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is the objective of the policy? So in the case of macro, usually the objective is one of the 4 macro aims. And then what are some of the types of policies that can achieve this? So you have learned, example, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and there are many aspects, or rather 2 aspects of monetary policy, supply side policy, and then now you've learned protectionism, which is a type of trade policy, right? And then there's you need to know the mechanism. How do the policies achieve the goal that they are aiming for? And of course, you need to know how to evaluate the policies. So the point I want to make is this. This is the insight that you should have to help you avoid any confusion. The insight is this, that one policy may have multiple impacts. So it can impact the objective, the original objective it set out to do. It could have some consequences that cannot be avoided. It could also have some unintended consequences that the policymakers perhaps couldn't foresee before implementing the policy. Even though you have learned things like fiscal policy, then you learned it in the context of stimulating economic growth. But you need to understand that that is because the objective at that particular context was economic growth. If you switch the context, in the context of trade and globalization, where the objective is slightly different, to improve the balance of trade, then the very same policy that you learned could also have another impact on another objective. Or it could just be by the way, it also affects something else. So just take note of this. When you learn policy, the tip is not so much to memorize the objective that the various policies can have, but really to be flexible and to know how the various policies may have mechanisms which lead to multiple objectives. All right, so that's as much as I can say in this introduction. As I go through section 3 proper, you will really see what I mean. Okay, so thank you very much. Let's stay tuned for the next series of lectures.